Hi, I'm Kane, and this is Camilla, and we're the 5 resellers. If you're not picking up some vintage items and learning about them, you're leaving money on the table.
In this video, we're going to tell you about a couple categories of vintage items, some clues to be looking out for in those categories to let you know that you should look those items up and see how much they're selling for.
There's a lot of big money in vintage items, and we're not just talking about clothing. We're going to talk about a few different categories, and we're doing a collaboration with Chelsea over at Monarch Alley, so you should definitely check her out too.
The first category, and one that you've probably heard of if you watch many of our videos, is blankets and quilts. First, we're going to talk about some blankets made out of yarn, which are usually crocheted. One thing to be on the lookout for with crocheted blankets is what's called granny squares. So those are tiny squares, and they're usually brightly colored, and those are definitely things that people are looking for. They're the type of blanket that people, want and are looking for online. So definitely be on the lookout for those granny squares. When it comes to these blankets, size does matter.
Yeah, the bigger they are, the better they are, the more they're going to sell for it. Because look, when you're talking about crocheted items or quilted items, it takes a lot of work. The bigger it is, the more material it takes, the more man hours it's going to take to put it together. And just think about just regular bedding, right? The queen size, king size are going to be much more expensive than a double.
And then for quilts, what you're looking for is some of those classic patterns, like the double wedding ring quilt, the Dresden plate, the grandmother's flower garden, the log cabin, things like that. So some of the older patterns, rather than just like a plain patchwork or even like a 9 square. The more complex the pattern is, the better it is. Because again, it's about the work that went into that. So those items, because it's more work, there just aren't as many of them. And with quilts, you're really looking for those quilts that don't have rips, definitely have very few stains, and you're looking mostly for homemade ones. So if it has a store tag on there, you know it's probably not vintage, or even if it is vintage, it might not have the following that, like the idea of some homemade quilt would. So how do you know that a quilt or a blanket is vintage? Well, with blankets, it's kind of harder to tell because yarn pretty much looks the same throughout, time. However, with quilts, you can usually tell based on the fabric. Nowadays, you can kind of tell that it's current fabric versus vintage or even antique quilts. They often have a different type of fabric, and you can tell by the amount of wear that's on there, how thin the quilt is, at least like that outside fabric, how you can tell how much it's been washed, really, the wear on it. So that would be what I would suggest. However, current homemade quilts in those, kind of old school patterns also do well. So you can also pick those up, just don't mark them as vintage.
And as you probably already know, anything that's older than 20 years is actually considered technically vintage. And so sometimes a quilt especially will have a tag. The person who has made the quilt might date it 2000. And so at this point, it's technically vintage. So in that way, you can also tell that it's vintage because of the date. Next, let's talk about vintage hats. Well, first of all, they're really easy to ship. They generally cost nothing, and they don't take up that much storage space. So you should definitely be taking a look at this and, see if you can make $1 turn into 20 consistently, or even hundreds, because some of these vintage hats can go for a lot of money. What you want to be looking out for are, brands, companies, or even sports teams that are very well known. It's worth taking another look at and giving it a chance. It really doesn't take that much more time to look it up at that point. Now, aside from what is actually printed on the hat, the embroidery and whatnot, there are some brands that make the hats that are very widely known and sought after. One is K Products, Louisville Manufacturing, Sports Specialties, and then there's also Starter, Logo Athletic, and New Era. These are some of the best vintage hat manufacturers. When it comes to some of the graphics that you see on hats, there is an all-over print that is, sometimes called big logo. The bigger and more wild it is, the better. And a different pattern to be on the lookout for is what is called a shark tooth pattern. Then there are some that have these diamond spikes. Also be on the lookout for some that have these 3 stripes on the side. And last, look for these hats that have this little scrambled egg pattern on the bill. So all of these things are very desirable in the hat collecting community. Be on the lookout for those.
So the next vintage category is coats. And we really have 2 main tips for looking at vintage coats. The first is to pick up pea coats that are made with high quality material, especially camel coats. So that camel color brown, it's like a light brown kind of tan color. So we've sold cashmere coats, wool cashmere blend coats, all of that. So those coats, because they are classic style, they're timeless, just like our video says, people are always looking for those because you can buy one of those coats and it lasts you for a lifetime. The main thing to be looking at with coats like that is that you really want to give it a really good look over before you buy it, because cashmere and wool are definitely susceptible to moths, and so you want to make sure that there aren't any small holes or any kind of damage on the coat. So this is true for all vintage items. Because of their age, you really want to pay close attention to their condition. And the second type of coat to be on the lookout for is fur coats. So this is kind of controversial. I know some people don't think that we should, have fur coats at all. However, the way we see it is that what people are looking for when they're looking for secondhand fur coats is that they don't want to contribute to the fur industry, but they still might want that warmth or that look of a fur coat. And so if you see them at the thrift store or you see them, wherever you source secondhand, those can also be a good vintage pickup, because there are people who want a fur coat but don't want to buy a new one because of ethical issues.
So shop secondhand and save it. It's vintage ready, it's already been made, and if you come across it, you should save it and keep it from going to the landfill.
Exactly. So the next category is vintage dresses, and I have two types of vintage dresses to share with you that are often good pickups because they are, again, that sort of timeless look. And the first is A-line dresses, and these are, like the ones that were popular in the 50s, but they've been popular throughout different decades. Those dresses, definitely, because there is a following for that type of style in the rockabilly and the pinup scene, that you can, still market those dresses using those keywords. And so you want to be on the lookout for these, especially the ones from the 50s, and you can usually tell that by looking at the tag. You can usually see if it has kind of a vintage style font, or even looking to see if there's a union tag somewhere in there. On the website, the Vintage Fashion Guild, there is a guide to union tags to help you date vintage clothing. So that's definitely a good resource. That's a way to date vintage clothing that has that union tag in there. So usually if it's made by a company, it would have that union tag in there, especially, during the 50s and 60s and things like that. If it's homemade, it might not, but again, you're really looking for that kind of 50s style, that A-line style. The next type of dress to be on the lookout for is called a prairie dress, and these are definitely popular right now. So it's kind of a dress that could be called cottagecore, could be called boho, but it usually has, light florals or, kind of very feminine type, pattern on there. Often very long. Often they have, tiered ruffles or even lace on them. One very popular designer of these prairie dresses is Gunny Sacks by Jessica McClintock. If you find one of those are definitely worth a lot of money. Those are very desirable. But even we've sold one that was homemade, and it just had that prairie dress style, and it sold very, very quickly, and it sold for good money, and it wasn't even in that good of condition. Definitely be on the lookout for that type of style where, they're often puff sleeve, think very Victorian sort of style, very, what you would see people wearing in the 70s, that the flower child type style, that sort of thing. So that's definitely a style to be on the lookout for, because people definitely want the actual vintage dresses. And currently the places that are selling the really nice prairie dresses, modern contemporary ones, they're really expensive. So the next category we have for you is scarves. So vintage scarves can be worth some money, but they aren't necessarily gonna make your week type sales, but they are definitely good things to be on the lookout for, because just like hats, they are often very cheap at the store. If you go to an outlet store like the bins, if you're buying scarves, there's pennies because they weigh basically nothing. Some of the types of scarves that we are often on the lookout for when we're outsourcing, when we're looking for vintage items, would be silk scarves, especially those square silk scarves. I feel like people tie those around their purse. They, wear them with their coat, all sorts of things like that. So in line with that, with silk scarves would be to definitely look out for designers that you might know. People are often looking for vintage scarves within a designer that they know. So if you see that and you think, well, this doesn't look quite right, I'm not really sure, it might be vintage and that's why it looks different. So definitely look those up as well. The nice thing about vintage is that it's available at many places. So depending on what your sourcing strategy is, there's a good chance that you are running into vintage wherever you are. And so the more that you know, the more that you can, use that sourcing time to your best advantage. So whether you are going to garage sales, estate sales, going to outlet stores or thrift stores, all of those places are places that vintage items can show up.
One of the great appeals of vintage items for us is that, sometimes it's the last stop at a thrift store or whatever, and we just want to save those items. They're so well made in a lot of cases. And like Camilla said, these items can be timeless. So be on the lookout for all of the things that we mentioned. Just put in your back pocket. Maybe something will ring in the future where you just remember that it's something worth looking up, because these are just starting places, right? We are going to link some additional resources below. Hopefully you kind of go down the rabbit hole and figure out some more stuff.
Those are our 5 categories of timeless vintage items to be on the lookout for. If you want the other 5, you have to go over to Chelsea's channel and check out her video over there. If you have any tips or suggestions of sourcing vintage yourself, leave them down in the comments so that we can get even more than 10. We would love to hear, what your best tips are. We would just love to have the comment section be a place of learning. So if you like this type of video, give it a thumbs up. That tells YouTube that this is a good video and that they should show it to more people.
Yeah.
Which is awesome. And if you aren't subscribed to our channel, consider subscribing. We would love to have you as part of our YouTube community.
Hopefully these 2 videos inspire you to be on the lookout for vintage items. There can be a lot of money in them. And good luck finding them. We'll see you later.
Bye.